Black perspectives haven't always been centered in the telling of America's story. Now, we're taking center stage. Introducing NPR's Black Stories, Black Truths, a collection of Black-led stories from NPR's podcasts. Search NPR Black Stories, Black Truths wherever you get your podcasts.
Support comes from Mercedes-Benz of Buckhead, where the power of electric meets the power of Mercedes. Introducing a lineup of electric vehicles, the EQB, the EQS sedan and SUV, the EQE sedan and SUV. The vehicles are all electric. The feeling is all Mercedes. Mercedesofbuckhead.com.
Good morning. Seems like just yesterday that we were here, doesn't it? Seems like just yesterday. Well, Happy New Year to you all.
House Speaker John Burns there saying aloud what a lot of us have been feeling.
The Georgia legislature is back under the Gold Dome, gaveling in just a few weeks after a contentious redistricting special session.
And 2024, let's just say, has not gotten off to a slow start as Governor Brian Kemp delivered his 6th State of the State address.
Over the next 36 legislative days, there will be passionate debate, there will be disagreements, there will be tough votes, there will be long nights, and maybe even some short tempers. But in the middle of all of that, I ask that we also remember Georgia is different for a reason.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
And I'm politics reporter Rahul Bali. It's week 1 of the Georgia General Assembly.
And this is Dome Scramble, a pop-up podcast about the legislature and more from Political Breakfast and WABE News in Atlanta. So, Rahul, we are sitting under the Gold Dome. We are back again. 2024 is well underway. How are you feeling about this year?
I'm feeling like this is the beginning of a very, very long tunnel, and we don't see the light right now at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, it kind of feels that way a little bit with everything that is on the horizon for us this session. But you got a little bit of rest over the New Year's?
A little bit of rest, but yes, not enough.
It feels like the news never really stopped, though. We had that redistricting decision right in between Christmas and New Year's. There is no rest for the weary in Georgia politics, and we got to buckle up for this next year ahead.
And you know, one of the other things that happened during the break was we had these unfortunate swatting incidents and bomb threats here at the state capitol. And so I did want to mention that there's a noticeable bump up in security here at the state capitol, clearly a larger presence of state troopers and officers because of those incidents. And I felt like that was worth mentioning.
Okay, so we've mentioned we are at the Capitol right now. We are actually sitting in the House antechamber just through these wooden doors next to us, the House chamber, where earlier today, Governor Brian Kemp gave his 6th State of the State address. And this is a moment when we really get to hear at length from Governor Kemp about his priorities for the year. Rahul, what do Republicans really want to get done this session?
Well, let's start with the governor. The governor's priorities mainly were budget related, with Republican lawmakers also talking about the same thing. On hot button issues, we did hear Governor Kemp talking about getting voucher legislation across the line, something that failed last year after 16 Republicans defected on legislation that would have allowed parents in school with kids in low performing schools to be able to get $6,500 per child per year to go to private school or homeschool. Now, some of the issues we've heard from state Republican lawmakers include expanding gambling, specifically sports betting, casino gambling, betting on horse racing. Also, redoing legislation on prosecuting attorney qualifications commission. That's one of those commissions that would have had the power to discipline and remove district attorneys. Of course, there's a lot more we can talk about. As for the other two major leaders here under the Gold Dome, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, who is the president of the state Senate, he did a number of events late last year to roll out his priorities, including proposing a stipend to armed teachers in the classroom. And House Speaker John Burns laid out his priorities during the Georgia Chamber breakfast and his own meeting with reporters in this very room that we're sitting in. And he talked about changes to election law, like eliminating QR codes on ballots.
And Rahul, a big part of how the state communicates its priorities is through the state budget. There are billions in surplus. How do Republicans want to spend it?
So let's start with the governor, because the governor is really the person who starts the budget process. And he laid out those priorities in the Georgia Chamber breakfast and just now a few moments ago in his State of the State. In the amended 2024 budget that he just released, it goes from $32.5 billion when it was first signed last year to $37.5 billion. That's a big chunk of those surplus dollars. And a lot of that is going to be one-time expenses, including $1.5 billion to accelerate transportation projects around the state of Georgia. Then in the 2025 budget, we see the governor proposing more long-term spending, including a $2,500 base pay increase for all public K through 12 teachers and certified staff, along with a 4% cost of living increase for state employees, including University System of Georgia employees. Now, that brings us to Democrats and what they think about the governor's State of the State address. Sam, what are we hearing about their priorities?
So not long after the State of the State concluded, Democrats gathered on the stone stairs in the Capitol, and they had some pretty strong words about the governor's speech and his priorities. Namely, how he is using that huge surplus that you just mentioned. Let's take a listen for a moment to Senate Minority Leader Gloria Butler.
Don't let him fool you. Don't let him pull the wool over your eyes. That's what he's done, and that's the truth. Let's hold the governor accountable. Together, let's use this surplus to try to make the American dream, which feels out of reach for so many, a reality.
And Rahul, the biggest thorn, I would say, for Democrats is Kemp's ongoing refusal to expand Medicaid, even as 40 other states have done so. However, there is lots of chatter this session about Democrats' long-held dream of doing that, of expanding Medicaid. And that talk focuses on the possibility of a deal to reform hospital regulations called Certificate of Need. And that would be in exchange for maybe more fully expanding the Medicaid program to cover more low-income Georgians. Now, just to put a little caveat here, Medicaid expansion is seen as kind of a toxic phrase for most Republicans, but something different is in the air this session, it seems. Just take a listen to this cut from Senate Majority Leader Steve Gooch.
There's time to get it done in this session if that's what the desire of the General Assembly is.
Now, I should say, Kemp did not really go down this road in his State of the State address, so I think we're going to have to wait and see if this effort to expand Medicaid really gets any traction this session.
And Sam, one other thing I'm going to be watching for when it comes to Democratic opportunities and bipartisanship is on any expansion of gambling. In most cases, Republicans are going to need Democratic votes, especially anything involving a constitutional amendment, because that needs a 2/3 majority to pass both chambers.
So, Rahul, we've been talking about some late-breaking issues that have kind of unfolded during this very busy first week of the session. But I want to just push you back to last session for a second. When we had Sine Die, there were so many unpassed, unfinished bills, some of which were priorities of Republican leadership that were left on the floor. And a lot of that seemed to boil down to disagreement between Republican leaders in the House and the Senate. And I'm curious how you're kind of looking for that dynamic to continue to play out this session.
You know, as I mentioned, we saw the school voucher legislation not get through here in the House. Mental health legislation failed across the hall in the state Senate. So, you know, I asked House Speaker John Burns in this very room about the divide between the two chambers, and I want you to notice the 4-second pause he takes while giving this answer.
They have some priorities, we have some priorities. I'll just say this to you. I am, and I believe my members are, about good common sense solutions for Georgia families. I'm sure other people believe their solutions and their issues are just as important.
That pause, quite striking, Rahul. What do you think that means?
I think I had to think about that answer because, you know, we've been hearing in the building about some of the issues between that side of the building, the Senate, and this side where we're sitting in the House. Remember, these two chambers both have new leaders. They're both now entering their second year leading their respective bodies. Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones over in the Senate and John Burns over here in the House. By the way, I do want to mention one interesting solution that may have come up. House Majority Leader Chuck F. Stration rolled out the calendar for the rest of the session.
Lawmakers love to get an early calendar, and reporters included. We can plan our lives a little bit.
Exactly. And Chuck F. Stration, the majority leader, mentioned that there will be 4 committee workdays, and he specifically mentioned for the bodies to work on each other's legislation. Speaking of the calendar, we're only going to be working for 4 Fridays. We will not be on session on Valentine's Day, and our final day is going to be Thursday, March the 28th.
Okay, so let's stay in March for a minute. March 12th is Georgia's presidential primary. And even once we get to the end of this session, our work is not done. It is going to continue because, if you haven't heard, we are in an election year. And Rahul, you have covered so many sessions. I won't name how many, but talk to me about how this election year dynamic shapes what gets done and what doesn't, and the kind of bills that get prioritized over others.
You know, Sam, I think every year is different, even election years. For example, Governor Kemp is not on the ballot this year versus 2 years ago. As for legislative races, there are a couple of dynamics there. Those worried about a primary challenge and those worried about a general election challenge. Whether it's, as I mentioned, the issues around the school voucher legislation that failed, you know, some of those 16 Republicans who voted against it, they could face challenges. There could be the issues around gambling and, you know, whether you're for or against it. And then there's the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center, whether people support it or not support it.
And Rahul, as you talk about these legislative races and the potential for a general election challenge, we should just note real quick that there aren't too many seats that are competitive for the state legislature because of gerrymandering. So a lot of members who are worried about challenges are really thinking more about spring primaries, not necessarily November.
I would agree with that. It's going to be just those handful of seats. And again, we've had redistricting, so the districts are going to look a little different. But you're right. Most of those challenges are going to be around the spring primaries, which means the issues at stake may be on the extremes.
So, Rahul, I just want to zoom out for a moment as we're talking about elections and the broader scope of 2024. You know, in Kemp's State of the State, he really didn't shy away from talking about the election. I think it was the second sentence of his speech that he brought up the fact that Georgians are headed to the ballot box this year. And what he said is that the choices that Georgians are going to make this fall will determine the future of the country. And he used the opportunity of this State of the State speech to really draw some contrast between Georgia and Washington, D.C. Let's listen.
I believe we have an opportunity here in Georgia, an opportunity to highlight a different path. One of the brilliant principles of America's founding is the role of the states. For them to be the laboratories of democracy, to protect the liberties and freedoms of their citizens, and to carry out the will of the people. Our founders didn't believe the states should always look to the federal government for answers. And by judging by current comparison, I don't think we would have much to learn.
Now, I should note, though, that at the end of the speech, he did try and end on more of a note of bipartisanship, recognizing that Georgia is different, that lawmakers do work across party lines more often than not, is what he said. So I will be eager to see the tone and tenor of this session. Is it one of lawmakers working across party lines, or do we see some of the heated debate that can come up in an election year?
So let's take a break here. When we come back, we'll dig into some other big political news of the week. This is Dome Scramble from WABE.
The world has changed, from shifts in power to a mental health crisis. So with all this social change, how do we balance the human desire for empathy, the business need for productivity, and the hope to make an impact in our community? This is a new podcast, The Social Impact Leader. I'm Jeff Shinabarker. Join me as we explore people doing work a little different. Available every Wednesday at wabe.org/podcast or wherever you get your podcasts.
WABE. Ever wondered where to find the best dumplings in town? Curious about Atlanta's obsession with lemon pepper? Join us on Savory Stories, a new podcast as we uncover the untold tales behind Atlanta's culinary scene. From the roots of your favorite dishes to the creators that bring them to life, we're diving deep into the heart of the city's food culture. Listen to Savory Stories at wabe.org/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. WABE.
Welcome back to Gold Dome Scramble. Okay, Rahul, we pride ourselves on being a podcast all about the legislature, and that is, I promise, where we will keep our focus again this year. But this is a special year, and so we're going to dig out some space for other Georgia politics news, too.
So, let's start with Georgia's presidential primary is March the 12th. We'll see who's going to be the nominee, if the nominees are clinched by then or not. And then down the street, actually over our shoulders, is the Fulton County Courthouse. And the wrangling continues over the scheduling of a trial date for former President Trump and more than a dozen defendants in a sweeping election interference case.
Okay, so Rahul, let's stay there with the 2024 election. This week, Vice President Kamala Harris came to Atlanta as the Biden team is beginning to hit the road in earnest to campaign. Set the scene for me.
So earlier this week, we were at the Gathering Spot. That's near the campuses of Georgia Tech and Coca-Cola's headquarters. It's a Black-owned networking, working space, event venue, which has hosted notable events, including a visit by then-candidate Joe Biden and Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens' election night party. The vice president came in to meet privately with advocates and community leaders about voting rights. Before that meeting began, the vice president addressed the media for about 8 minutes. She didn't take questions. And in her remarks, she included this attack on the state of Georgia on the issue of voting rights.
The right to vote and having access to the ballot and ensuring that access in times where there are, I believe, intentional, full-on attempts to make it more difficult for people to vote so that they will not vote. When we look at the state of Georgia, in many ways, it is ground zero on this issue.
So some of the other issues that she brought up included gerrymandering, attacks on election workers, limits on drop boxes, and voter registration challenges. Now, it's worth noting that voting rights activists have had a few losses on these fronts, something that, Sam, you can talk about, including some of the decisions that happened while we were away.
Yeah, so let's pick up there and talk a little bit more about how we're going to vote in 2024, not just who we're going to vote for. As you mentioned, in the last couple of weeks, a flurry of court decisions upholding the redrawn redistricting maps on the legality of mass voter challenges, and then this week, the start of a big trial about Georgia's voting machines. Election security activists say that Georgia's voting machines are vulnerable to interference. This began, I should note, before Dominion voting machines became, a frequent target of far-right conspiracy theories. This is a long-running lawsuit about the voting machines. And a federal report did come out that found some security vulnerabilities in Georgia's voting software. Though I should note that the report didn't uncover any evidence that they've been successfully exploited in the past. However, allies of former President Trump were indicted last year for accessing voting system software, and all of that has really underscored the attention on Georgia's voting machines and software. The Secretary of State's office says that Georgia's election security practices are top tier. They're standing by the use of these machines. And now, after this trial wraps up, it will be up to Judge Amy Totenberg to decide what this voting process will look like in 2024.
And before we go, there were also, Sam, some big developments this week in former President Donald Trump's legal cases, which could also shape the election.
Yeah, these issues are so intertwined, right, Rahul? The election and the outcome of these legal cases. So the thing I want to talk about, this was a hearing related to the federal case. So this was in Washington, D.C. But the implications of that hearing will affect the Georgia case, too. And the question at hand was whether to dismiss the federal election interference case against former President Trump on the grounds that former presidents cannot be prosecuted for acts they committed while they were in office. Now, a U.S. district court has already ruled that Trump and other former presidents do not enjoy the special absolute immunity that he is claiming. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit seemed to agree at the hearing this week. Just take a listen to this cut of tape from Judge Florence Pan, who is pressing Trump's lawyer, D. John Sawyer.
Could a president order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival?
He would have to be and would speedily be, impeached and convicted before the criminal prosecution.
What if he weren't?
So you can hear that skepticism from the judge there. But Rahul, the real important takeaway here is not just the content of this argument, but what it means for the timeline of Georgia's case. If this case is appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court and the court decides to take it up and hear oral arguments on this question, that might not happen for another couple of months. That would delay the federal case, which is set to begin in March, and in turn, that would delay the Georgia case, which of course a date has not been set. So really at stake is whether the former president is tried for the actions he took after the 2020 election before this next election when he is the front runner for the Republican nomination.
It also decides how crazy our calendar may be this fall as well. That's it for this week. Dome Scramble is a production of the WABE Politics team. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
And you can get more Georgia politics every Tuesday and Thursday with the Political Breakfast podcast. And check out wabe.org/underthegoldDome. We'll be back next week.